you get, depending on the project, they've subcontracted. So IRI,
last year in Africa, at least by
Zona is starting to help.
obviously Africa.
Sometimes some of the European consortia are starting to help.
They had
The problem is that weather and climate data is sovereign data.
they had the African
And so countries
really make it
don't
like
want to give up the net
united.
service, and they don't want to share. And
Yeah.
so that side has been, I've not been heavily involved in that side, but that side's been very challenging. I mean, my side of it, which is related to this in a lot of ways, what are the farmers doing,
Figure out how other countries
is its own challenge on top of that challenge, right? I mean, even if you have great information to deliver,
Efforts, I know on like
farmers don't need it.
negotiators,
Farmers can't act on it.
negotiators on agriculture issues.
Bother, right?
I think before Durban, there was a lot of energy around. Like in 2011, I think.
well, that was the like no
A
agriculture
large portfolio?
thing, and
I mean, is it a huge amount? Or is it growing? Or
well, actually, it did work out.
All right.
Well, yeah.
What a way to get people going. I think we've found a new way to start our events at the Wilson Center.
Man.
I didn't know you guys were such a rowdy group. You were so quiet before. Well, welcome again. I'm Roger Mark D'Souza. I direct the programs on global sustainability and resilience here at the Wilson Center. I know many of you are familiar with the Wilson Center. We serve as a living memorial to President Wilson. And in his legacy, we address the key international development issues. And I'm really pleased that we have an opportunity to look today at pathways to climate smart agriculture in Africa. Because I think, as many of you know in this room, it really is a critical issue. And for us here at the Wilson Center, it is an issue that transcends many sectors in which we work. So the focus of our work on global sustainability and resilience is on the connections between the environment and security, in particular conflict, on the connections between development, climate and resilience, and women and health. And when I think of issues around climate smart agriculture, I think it covers a lot of those sectors. And in fact, when Integra had approached us and asked whether we would be willing and interested in hosting an event around this issue, I went back and looked at the times when we had discussed climate smart agriculture in our programming here at the Wilson Center. And some of the headlines that you see in the material that we have for you outside revolve around a closer look at USAID's strategy. Colombian farmers adjust to changing conditions with climate smart agriculture. Can climate smart agriculture help feed Africa's growing population? Africa's trifecta: food security, resilience, and demographics. How is climate smart agriculture related to these issues? How to create a new climate for peace. What's the role of climate smart agriculture in addressing climate fragility risks? What next? Climate mitigation after Paris. What's the role of climate smart agriculture? So it seemed to me that this is a topic that we had looked at from various angles. So really the question that we're looking at today, the adoption of climate smart agriculture, was really a critical one. And we were very excited to be able to host the event today with Integra and Clark University and of course with support from USAID. So welcome. I'm delighted to have a packed house. And we are actually going to jump straight into the program. The format for the program today is a brief PowerPoint presentation that will present some of the results and the key findings from the analysis that was conducted. And Ed Carr will walk us through that. And then we have a panel of colleagues who will be giving some of their thoughts and perspectives from the work that is being presented. I think many of you know Ed. Ed Carr is a longtime friend and colleague of the program here at the Wilson Center. He's a tenured professor and director of international development, community, and environment, that department at Clark University. And he also directs the Humanitarian Response and Development Lab. From 2003 to 2015, he was assistant and then associate professor in the Department of Geography of South South Carolina. And anytime we welcome Ed here, we know he's going to be provocative and will always have something cutting edge to say. So we're always delighted to have Ed with us. And I think, in particular, Ed is someone who spends some time within USAID, so understands a little bit how USAID operates, so brings not just the field experience and the analytical tools, but a real sense of how one of the major donors in this space operates. He was a AAAS science fellow serving at USAID, first as the climate change coordinator for the Bureau of Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance, and later as the climate change science advisor on the climate change team in the Bureau for Economic Growth, Education, and Environment. So real practical application from many perspectives. So Ed, I'd like to hand it over to you, and we look forward to hearing some of the outcomes and deliverables from the analysis.
Grab my water. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Roger Mark, for the introduction. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Before I launch into this, very, very quickly, I am presenting, but I'm presenting on something that a fairly good-sized team put together, a number of whom are here. So John Anderson's lurking in the back, Jim Ozels is over here, Sheila Nziri from Hurdle, my lab back at Clark, Susan Wangui out in Kenya, Boubacar Berry in Burkina Faso, David Quinn's been herding us toward the finish line. And of course, the Africa Bureau has been presenting us a lot of comments, and Tegan Blaine and Merritt, who I know is hiding somewhere, there's Merritt, have been also constructively pushing this. So I'm kind of the mouthpiece through which a lot of this thinking is coming through. So both don't overread my expertise or blame me for everything, I think is what I'm trying to say. Although you might have to blame me for the presentation. We'll see. So very, very quickly, you're all here probably because you have some sense of what climate-smart agriculture is, but I think it's worth remembering that climate-smart agriculture is a conceptual framework. It is not just a set of tools. Very, very importantly, it is a conceptual framework. It has three major aims, which you see there: sustainably increase production, build resilience to and foster adaptation to climate change, or climate change impacts at least, and to reduce and or mitigate greenhouse gas emissions from agricultural production wherever you can do it. And really what motivated the report that we did and this presentation today, and why you're all here, is that despite the fact we know that climate-smart agriculture could have, and in some cases does have, clear benefits both for farmers and for the larger world in which we live, the uptake of climate-smart agriculture, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, is, as you see, slow, piecemeal, and largely unsustained. That's not a theoretical claim, that just is what's going on. So this requires us to step back for a second and ask what we mean by adoption, actually, if you think about what's going on in our report. And really, the conventional understanding of CSA adoption, which is really the same as most agricultural adoption, or I would argue even development technological adoption, is dependent on a couple of key factors. So you have the accessibility of the new technology, the promotion of the technology to farmers, the provision of technical assistance to smallholders, and the facilitation of increased access to markets. Most of you have heard some version of these things before. The problem with this narrative of adoption and the framing of this narrative adoption is that it rests on a number of pretty problematic assumptions about adoption, such as the fact that adoption is somehow an issue only of technology and training, that technologies actually work in the same way everywhere, that people are motivated by the same things everywhere, or that even people in the same place are all motivated by the same things. And there's a big pile of empirical evidence to suggest that basically none of these assumptions is actually true. So our narrative of adoption is really, really problematic here. And really, one of the biggest messages we have today is that, yeah, technology absolutely matters when we're talking about climate-smart agriculture. We're not trying to bin that or anything. But that as much as it is about technology, it is perhaps even more about the wider social, political, and institutional environment in which agriculture is playing a part. And that includes a whole host of things, ranging from other kinds of livelihoods activities to the different identity roles and responsibilities that people have. That includes gender, but actually really gets out into intersectional framings of identity, gender, and other kinds of things, and as they come together to form different roles and responsibilities. Decision-making timeframes of different kinds of farmers, the risks that farmers experience, et cetera. These are things that in my work I would argue are simply livelihoods, but not livelihoods as ways of making a living, livelihoods as ways of framing and controlling and organizing the world. It's a broader framework that really asks, how do people live in this place? Climate-smart agriculture intersects with that very question. How do people live in this place? If we're going to understand adoption, that's the question we need to answer. So to start to look at this, very, very quickly, this was our goal, just to explore the wider range of factors that we think were shaping the observed outcomes of CSA adoption in sub-Saharan Africa. And we're going to try to identify both practice and knowledge gaps, and I actually think we succeeded in both. We did this through three broad sets of information. First, a fairly comprehensive literature review involving about 500 documents, both gray and refereed literature. Interviews with about 40 expert practitioners, stakeholders, subject matter experts in climate-smart agriculture, and then in-country surveys in two different countries, Kenya and Burkina Faso, talking to farmers who've been engaged with climate-smart agriculture. Now, these are not meant to be representative, except maybe the lit review, which covers an awful lot of the literature. But in the other areas, it's not meant to be representative samples of the entire world. The idea here was to capture sort of the dominant narratives coming from different kinds of stakeholders in this world, and by triangulating these, build some kind of an understanding of the disjoints and understanding between different kinds of stakeholders here, as well as kind of the broader narratives of adoption that exist out there. And this gives us a chance to both see the things that were consistent across these data sets and were different, and point us to things we need to work out. So, from the lit review, we ran into broadly a set of broad factors. Now, I should point, well, I'll point out in a second. First of all, I'm not going to read these all to you. I'm not going to commit the PowerPoint sin of doing that. The point is they fall under a couple of broad categories, both economic and production characteristics, social and cultural context, and then the broad enabling environment. Worth looking at here in terms of sort of the meta analysis, most of the lit was there. Focused really on the same stuff I talked about when I was talking about adoption most broadly in terms of economic and technological factors that would shape people's uptake. It's not surprising. That's our dominant narrative. That's where the lit would tend to focus. It is important to point out, however, these are the factors we saw across a set of practices that we selected, a subset of climate-smart agriculture practices that we selected. And now I shall really commit a PowerPoint sin, data table. Don't look at the data table, because seriously, you don't need to. All you need to see in the painful data table is that each one of those practices is a vertical column. 3 crosses means it has a big impact on adoption. 1 cross means not really much of an impact on adoption. And what you can see is there is no single factor that has a big impact across every practice. So everything we're talking about today still is going to have to be drilled down to particular practices if you want actionable findings. To go to Roger Mark's point, I'm thinking about how do you make this actionable. It matters which practices you select. When we go to the experts, so to speak, the folks who've been working on this over time, we got them to talk about both barriers and incentives to uptake. This is the rate at which they tended to report these different categories of barrier and incentive. One thing worth pointing out that is pretty interesting here first is that there's actually pretty good correlation between things that they pointed out on one side that were barriers and then incentives. There's a degree of that. I mean, about half of the things that are barriers have incentives on the other side that might address them. Interestingly, how to read the barriers that don't have any incentive. Part of it is that there are barriers, they just don't matter that much. So you don't want to necessarily have to change your whole program to address a low barrier. This is people voting with their minds, their projects, their programs. What are the most important barriers? What are the most important incentives to offset those barriers? The other thing that's interesting is the degree to which the experts, so to speak, who are working on the ground, who are working in the field on this, and the literature aligned with each other, which is not tremendously well. They did align. I mean, you can see that there are a degree of these factors, but there are a number of factors that are not mentioned. You know, they're mentioned in the literature, not mentioned by the experts here as being important. So we have some disjoint right away in terms of different data sets and who believes what is important. It is also, so then we can look at the farmers. And we look at the farmers and you get a different set of both incentives and barriers. And interestingly, with the farmers, nearly every barrier they named an incentive to deal with. In other words, they didn't give us any like barriers they didn't care about. All the barriers mattered to the farmers pretty much. But on top of this, one thing to point out is that the farmers we dealt with, this is just a data issue that I just wanted to be transparent about. The farmers that we dealt with did not look at, they were not engaged with the entire set of climate smart agricultural practices that we looked at in the literature. They were only engaged with a small subset. So when you resampled these farmers in terms of what the literature said was important for the practices they were undertaking, there were some minor changes in the overall literature in terms of what was seen as important. Access to external inputs and farmer familiarity with practice jumped into this. So when we look at alignment of the farmers with the literature, by the way, by making that adjustment, I actually managed to find more things they agreed with. But that should disturb you a little bit. The literature and the farmers don't actually have a whole lot. I mean, it's about 50% match. That's not good. All right, and that, if you're getting some hints of why we're having uptake issues, there it is. So you compare that, then you compare it to the experts, though, the people who are actually working on this on the ground, and perhaps unsurprisingly, a much higher degree of overlap in terms of what the farmers said was important and what the folks who are practicing this work say is important. And if you try to find folks where they agree on all of them, this should also worry you a little bit. There's not very many practices, very many incentives and barriers that everybody is naming as significant. So this right away is something we need to be thinking about, is that the literature, the people who are working on this sort of from our perspective programmatically, experts, that kind of stuff, and then the farmers, there is not a huge degree of alignment up and down those sets of information, those ways of framing this. That probably speaks greatly to the challenges we're having here. To pivot then to the key findings, because I'm not meant to be up here for very long, so I'm not going to take a ton of time on this. I'm going to go through each of these with just quick examples. But these are the headlines here. Economics matter to adoption, but in very complex ways, not in straightforward ways like we tend to think. To be adopted, climate smart agriculture needs to align with social and cultural values and norms. You can't just deposit something from a different planet on people and expect them to just pick it up. And then markets and institutions are critical to climate smart agricultural adoption, but again, you'll see that that's complicated. And the fourth point is simply what I just pointed out to you, that we have mismatched understandings of what motivates or is a disincentive to climate smart agriculture across the lit, experts, and farmers, and that is something we're going to have to spend some time trying to rectify and thinking about. For each of the key findings, very quickly, economics matters, but in complicated ways. Cost shows up as an important factor across all the data sets. This is not terribly surprising here. However, the farmer perspective on cost, and say the conventional wisdom of practitioners, doesn't necessarily align. Farmers are much more worried about initial costs. They report it twice as often as did the technical experts, whereas technical experts were really emphasizing long-term costs and the farmers didn't talk about them much. Now, for those of you who've actually spent a lot of time working with farmers in sub-Saharan Africa, as I have, this is probably terribly unsurprising since the decision frame for most farmers is roughly one season. So they're not going to worry about a long-term cost. They're really worried about the immediate cost right now. The experts might be seeing a downstream problem that the farmers aren't going to focus on initially because that's just not their issue at that moment. What we are seeing, though, is that clearly practitioners of climate smart agriculture need to work on their framings of farmer decision timescales to better align things that they're trying to bring in with those timescales, but also how farmers understand different costs and benefits, because our understanding of them may not align, and we'll talk about that a little bit under sort of the social and cultural stuff in a second. Last quick point here, climate smart agriculture approaches and practices that promote multiple objectives and that promote diversification are likely to see greater adoption by smallholder farmers because they can be taken up in different ways and used in different kinds of ways, frankly tailored to the context by the people using them much more easily. In terms of aligning with sort of social and cultural values and norms, these norms, these values, they create both opportunities and challenges and barriers and risks that shape CSA adoption. But they're often overlooked by the lit and by the experts. We don't see this popping up enough. For example, we see that farmer familiarity with a practice is incredibly important to farmers, but doesn't necessarily show up a lot in the lit and only a little bit with the experts. This is not because farmers need to already know how to use something. It's because familiarity with a practice suggests that practice has in many ways already been integrated with the ways in which people live in a particular place. So they can actually take on that practice without creating massive social, economic, cultural disruption. That's a really key factor that we have to be looking at. Interestingly, I thought this was an amazing factor that popped out of the data. The issue of short-term climate-related risk created by climate-smart agricultural interventions is actually a huge disincentive. It's a huge barrier for farmers. Because sometimes we're coming in with climate-smart agricultural interventions thinking 20 years out, they're thinking next harvest. And if the thing you bring in any way, shape, or form, disrupts the next harvest, or challenges what they're doing to manage risk on that next harvest, they see that as enhancing climate risk. Why would they take that on? That's not climate smart to them. So again, there's that timescale problem. The point here is that climate smart agriculture, despite the fact we're calling it climate smart, A, may not be actually climate smart in the wrong timescale, and certainly is not inherently do no harm. We have to think very carefully about what we're bringing, when we're bringing it, and where. Another point is that farmers are not going to adopt CSA practices that either radically challenge existing livelihoods, and again, I mean that in terms of the ways people live in particular places. You are not going to reshape social norms with climate-smart agriculture. That is not, first of all, it's not a wise use of your money or programming. Second of all, it just won't work. There's a tremendous literature on how that doesn't play out. And then anything that lowers their capacity, as I said, to address immediate risks of climate variability, farmers just will not take up. Not unless you're bringing in massive safety net programs to replace what resilience activities they already have. Markets and institutions, they are critical. Another big finding for us. In a lot of African countries, there are structural constraints to markets and supporting institutions that are going to severely constrain the adoption of climate-smart agricultural practices. And you see there the dysfunctional markets, dysfunctional government institutions, weak land tenure systems. All of these things come together, though, in something that John has been calling sort of the churn of subsistence, where you can get additional, like we tend to think that farmers want additional production, they will sell that additional production, they can get income so they can become more food secure. But what we're actually seeing is as farmers get to a certain point, in a lot of settings, either market conditions or, for example, middlemen, bad transportation networks, other kinds of issues, prevent farmers from actually realizing much benefit from that incremental unit of production above subsistence, which by itself becomes a disincentive to produce more. Why should they? And so there's a real issue there that we have to look at in terms of a lot of these conditions if we're going to see CSA get taken up. So again, if we're going to see this taken up and adopted at a national scale, I would actually argue at even a community or a household scale, there are basic foundational conditions and practices that are required in the ag sector, and these transcend any specific farm technology. Again, climate-smart agriculture is an approach, not a technology per se. Whoop. So, to kind of wrap this up, I told you I wasn't going to be up here for too long. Climate-smart agriculture does present a tremendous opportunity here. And it presents what I think, and I think our team would argue, is a pretty urgent opportunity for a larger and more systemic view of the constraints that are facing agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa. And I would say you probably could put opportunities in there as well. Key point here, we have some significant disconnects between the literature, between sort of subject matter experts, between the farmers themselves. That is one of our biggest challenges. We have to find a way to somehow align these things. And that when we have key differences between these perceived barriers and incentives, one of the things we're realizing is that a lot of practitioners, and certainly the literature, don't necessarily seem to have traced the value of an incentive that they're naming back to a particular barrier it might address. In other words, we're not dealing with this contextually enough. And really, in the end, even though a lot of what we're talking about in this report is broad constraints and broad opportunities for climate-smart agriculture, once again, we get down to a particular practice in a particular place. That's when you're going to figure out what people can and can't take up and work with. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ed. I think you present a number of things that are very compelling. I wonder, as you and the team looked at the results, was there anything that was particularly surprising for you? Was this something that you said, really, we didn't anticipate this particular finding, and it has some broad implications?
So, is it cynical to say I wasn't surprised?
I'm not surprised to hear you say that.
Okay, yeah. You know me too well. Quick side note, and then I'm going to throw it to the rest of the team, actually, if they want to talk, because I know John's here and Jim's here. Yesterday, I taught my graduate seminar in environment and development. And one of the things I do in that seminar is I make my class read stuff from the 1930s, colonial officers, and we happen to be talking about ag yesterday. And I have a host, I could read them to you, I can dig them up on my iPhone. A host of quotes from ag officers in the 1930s saying, hey, it turns out these guys know how to farm better than we do. So it's 85 years later, same message. That's a little worrying. So I don't think I was surprised, maybe I'm a little aggravated that we're doing this again. But if this helps get that through. But I will admit, I was a little bit surprised that the lit was as disjointed from the subject matter experts and the farmers. That caught me off guard. I expected there to be a degree of it, but I didn't expect it to be that large. Okay. I don't know, John is probably well positioned to think about this. He's hiding back there, though.
All right, great, thank you. So I'd like to move to the panel now. And Demola, I'd like to start with you. So you are the CSA coordinator for the Africa region at the bank, at the World Bank. And your expertise is in human environment relationships and vulnerability and resilience of ecosystems to global change. And at the bank, you are looking particularly at the science policy interface of climate smart agriculture, working with clients to realize increased productivity, enhanced resilience, reduced greenhouse gas emissions, and enhanced carbon sequestration in agricultural landscapes. And before you go in to give some of your thoughts and perspectives on what Ed has been talking about, I wonder if I could ask you a question to start with, and it's a question that on a term that is a very contentious term, resilience, and that Ed also had in his presentation. But looking at climate smart agriculture, what does resilience mean for you and for the bank in that context?
Okay. Thanks very much, Roger. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Well, resilience in the context of climate smart agriculture means that the farmland is able to resist the impacts of climate change, and it's able to continue to produce without substantial reduction in the productive capacity of the land. But resilience is not only about the land, because agricultural systems is a coupled human environment system. Mm-hmm. So we also look at resilience in terms of the humans that manage the land to ensure that productivity is continuous. So resilience in that aspect would mean that farmers are able to get some reasonable returns on the productive assets that they commit to production, irrespective of the perturbation that results from climate change. So in a nutshell, this is what we mean by resilience. And we tried to track it through a number of factors. We use buffer capacity, for instance. We look at self-organization, for instance, and we look at the ability of the farming community to coordinate and initiate counterbalance measures when there are changes to, in the environment in which they're producing. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So what are your thoughts on this question of adoption of CSA? What are your perspective? How are you thinking about this?
Okay, let me start off by saying that I'm surprised that soil and land is not playing a major role in the adoption of systems. So this may have to do with the fact that maybe the technologies that were chosen are actually technologies that we do not have the role of improved soil management playing a factor. So this might be something that we need to, a caveat that we need to put in place when we eventually finalize the results, because soil, soils, we know that soils in Africa is the starting point for many of the agricultural practices that we want to put in place. Now, coming back to my perspective, I would want to mention 4 specific points that would that could hinder adoption, or that we need to pay close attention to in the 21st century in Africa. We all know that climate change and food insecurity are the twin crises that may define Africa's future. There's no doubt about that. That is well known by policymakers as well as farmers themselves. Now, the first thing we need to do is that we need to strengthen the evidence base for climate smart agriculture. So when we are talking about climate models that we use and other tools that we need for policy and decision making, they have to be at the appropriate skills. And they have to be relevant to the unit of decision making that the farmers and the planners will need to use. And we also need to take a note at not only the spatial skills, but also the temporal skills, as Ed correctly mentioned in his presentation. Now, we're interested in productivity and climate benefits of the different climate technologies that are being rolled out by researchers. And what works in different agroecologies will also be an important factor to take into consideration. Then is the fact that climate smart agriculture can sometimes involve painful trade-offs. So how do we manage trade-offs between productivity and adaptation, or between productivity and mitigation, as the case may be? So that will be some of the evidence basis that the farmers and decision makers need to move the climate smart agriculture agenda forward. Secondly, we must foster policies that stimulate private investments in CSA. I mean, a lot have been said concerning the enabling environment for CSA implementation. So we need to develop farmers' capacity to adopt new technologies and practices. There's a need for inclusive knowledge systems. I mean, and the role of knowledge system is to strengthen farmers' knowledge, to anticipate changes, and to decide on what are the options that are available to enable me address the changes imposed by climate, by the changing climatic conditions. Then also, equitable access to land is just a sine qua non for many of the climate smart agricultural practices. Then is the third point that I want to mention is there's a need for institutional reforms. There's no doubt about that. The institutional capacity to leverage investments would have to be beefed up. Then we have to strengthen agricultural research and development in a manner that anticipates the changing climatic conditions. Some research recently indicates that plants now have a way of changing their internal physiology to adapt to climate change themselves by producing more toxins. So this is an additional challenge that we need to put into consideration. So, and social safety nets can sometimes be useful and can sometimes be a part of the adaptation measures that we take in some cases, and also the need for risk management systems to be further developed. Then the last is there's a need for increased finance. In 2003, there is the Maputo Accord that recommended 10% to be devoted to agriculture. Now, to date, only 10 or 11 countries in Africa have been able to meet that target. So that means that governments themselves have to do something. National governments in Africa have to do something to improve, to increase investment in agriculture. Now, traditionally speaking, we find that investment in agriculture is usually insufficient to meet the challenges. Now, climate change is an additional challenge to the problem of insufficient investment. And an estimate states that you need between $230 to $260 billion per year to adapt developing countries' agricultural systems to climate change, in addition to producing food to meet the demand. So all of this investment gap have to be met through a combination of sources. One, national investments. Two, climate finance. Three, bilateral support, and as well as private sector funds. So let me add by saying that the private sector in Africa is paying attention to the opportunities in the land. We have 200 million hectares of uncultivated land that can be brought to productive uses. Then we also have an engaged and entrepreneurial youth that can also be used to stimulate agricultural development. All of these developments, if properly harnessed, can make agriculture to be transformational in the continent. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Ademola. I have more questions to you, but let's get some more comments and then come back. So, Caitlin, I'd like to go to you next. You are the program manager for Climate Smart Agriculture at the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Foreign Agricultural Service, the Office of Capacity Building and Development, and you work on designing and implementing programs that link partner governments with technical expertise to help build their capacity to address the synergies and trade-offs between productivity, resilience, and low emissions development in the face of climate change. So a little bit of what we're hearing just now. What are your thoughts and reactions?
Thanks. Yeah, so I guess first of all, I just want to say congratulations on the study. And it was great to see you're taking a broad approach at addressing climate smart agriculture. I think that would have been one of my key points had it not been how you framed the study. I think, yeah, it's important to show that also we're talking about things that are off farm. So they're not necessarily farm practices, and I thought the study did a good job highlighting that and trying to dig into that as well. And also I should just say, even though I work for USDA, all these thoughts are my own, so the government caveat out there. So yeah, when I was preparing for this, it's funny, I realized I had a lot more questions than answers. So I'm going to throw out some things that I've been thinking about, hopefully to broaden out the discussion and add on to the report. To give you a little bit of background, I used to work for the International Center for Tropical Agriculture. My job there was really to think about creating these decision support tools for thinking about how to prioritize climate smart agriculture. And we were really looking at it from an impact perspective. So what do we think would be the most climate smart initiative in a certain production system? And then what are the economic factors related to that? And then we looked at adoption barriers as well. But we were really prioritizing first on impact and then looking at adoption barriers. Can we overcome some of these, or can some of these practices just not be adopted? It would be interesting actually to think about it, should we be looking at it the other way? Would that help us get to scale? I'm not sure, but it would be a different twist on how I've been looking at the question. So that was my first thought. I guess something to mention on that, we did a lot of these climate smart ag profiles. We actually worked on a couple together. And what we saw there was that the most climate smart practices tended to be the ones with low adoption. And it wasn't that everything on that list was low adoption, but it happened to be that a lot of the ones that could potentially have the most impact had low adoption rates. So maybe we need to think about how we're targeting those and where we're trying to get the most bang from our buck. So I think that's an interesting piece, food for thought there. Wanted to start, I have 4 points that jumped out at me. And the first one is really a reminder of what we're trying to do with climate smart agriculture. So we have this Global Alliance for CSA, which is They want 500 million farmers to be practicing climate-smart agriculture by 2030, so that's 14 years from now. The African Union has a goal of having 25 million farmers adopting CSA by, what is that? That one's 2025, so that's 9 years. So these are huge goals and very short timelines. So the question of, is incremental adoption going to be enough, I think is something that's always in my mind. And will it get us there in the timeframes we need? Probably not. I think there's a lot that you could say to argue that we really need to be thinking about transitional systems change. And what does that mean? Because I also have an anthropology background. You don't want to go in and tell people to change what they're doing, but you also recognize that if we're trying to achieve the goals we've set, there is really a systems change that's needed in our food system. So I think that can be a really big challenge. And these are challenges at the scale of Facebook and Google, but we're working with people that don't have that kind of access. So how do we actually scale that out? So I think part of it is partnering, and just I want to remind us to think big today. The second piece that stuck out with me that very much came out in the report is the importance of context specificity in all of our decisions. So we know that certain practices need to be linked with different agroecozones and different production systems. And then there's also the social components that some of these practices aren't culturally accepted. There's adoption barriers that are context specific. That especially came out in the study. They're seeing different barriers come out across the different countries, also within countries between men and women. I think that's a really important point. But then if you put those two things I just said together, we're trying to scale this out in a huge way, but then it has to be context specific. How do you actually do that? And I don't actually have the answer, sorry about that. But I think the point is you have to have multiple approaches. So I could imagine, for example, one approach being to develop these knowledge leaders that know how to think about CSA as an approach and make these kind of broad decisions, but then they're reaching out to farmers and feeding that information up into the bigger national or regional decision making. But then you also need to provide guidance once you've made those decisions in a really simple way that's accessible for people and that's accessible at scale. And we've been talking a lot about ICT tools and how to get quick information out and back from farmers. But I think the most effective way to disseminate that information still needs to be assessed further. And then my fourth point was that, and it also links about the timeline question, we need to remember not only that we need to change things over time, but we're going to get more data, so we need to have iterative monitoring and analysis and management. And as we get data on the impacts, finding a way to reprioritize what we're doing with the farmers. And if we're getting data on behavior change, we need to understand these adoption barriers and incentives better, making sure we're adjusting our scaling approaches. And we need to figure out a system that does that quickly. And I know a lot of people have been working on that kind of question. How do you get information back quickly to have better iterative management? But I could see this conversation of CSA pathways being options that are both across different areas, but then across timelines. So you have things that you're doing now, but then you know you're leading, that capacity is leading you to do other things in the middle term or the long term to get us where we need to go. So those were some of my thoughts. Thanks.
I think you pose a lot of compelling questions. So I want to get in. Could you, so you said as you were looking at this, that you saw that a lot of the CSA interventions were the ones that could have the most impact but had low adoption rates. Mm-hmm. Could you give an example or two, please?
I could, except that I didn't have it in my notes, but I know I have it in here. Yeah, I think there was, so I have one of the CSA profiles from Kenya with me, theoretically. And sorry, it's not off the top of my head, but you can also download these and read them.
Good advertising.
Advertising for my old job.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think there were a number in livestock, for example. So here we're seeing like the use of biodigesters, for example. It could be something that's really interesting if you're looking at the mitigation angle. Low adoption, improved pasture management, and intensive dairy production was something that was of really high interest in terms of climate smartness, but was having low adoption at the moment. So I think things,
Right.
yeah, and it depends
Okay.
on every country, but
All
some
right.
examples.
And where can we access these?
There, if you just Google climate smart agriculture country profiles.
Okay,
there's-
great.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. All right, so Seth, we're on to you now, and you are at Eco Agriculture Partners as the Director of Policy and Markets, and you were leading Eco Agriculture's Partners analysis of policies and financial mechanisms to support integrated agricultural landscape management, and you're also working a lot on policy advocacy. So I wonder if you could share some of your thoughts and perspectives.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting us here. So as Roger Mark said, I work for an organization called Eco Agriculture Partners, and we focus on what we call integrated landscape management, which is focuses not only on the work that happens on farm, specific practices of agroforestry or conservation tillage, but the way that different types of units of land work together, and focuses on bringing stakeholders together in specific places to kind of work out issues and try to find solutions that work for the kind of the most number of actors. So in the context of climate smart agriculture, our entry point has been that kind of on the landscape, and trying to make sure that the kind of the discourse around climate smart agriculture includes that scale, the scale of the watershed, for example, and not only on-farm practices. So that's where we're coming from. And I have kind of just 2 points to make, which I think emphasize some things that have already been said. The first one is on and terminology and the importance of terminology for communication. So our experience at Eco Agriculture Partners, we have served as the secretariat for a kind of a collective of agricultural development and environmental organizations called the Landscapes for People, Food, and Nature, that focuses on these landscape ideas. And early on in that process, we realized that practically each of these organizations were using different terms to describe the same thing. And then in some cases, they were actually using the same term to describe different things. And to get it ended up, it gummed up the system quite a bit. I'm sure you've all had the experience where you have a meeting or a series of meetings in a process and realize you're not really talking about the same thing. So that went on for a while, and we finally we tried to sit down and figure out all the different terms we could that were the same, that we thought was what we were talking about. We came up with like 80 of them, and we kind of put them all up and decided, okay, we're not going to use any one specific term. We're going to come up with this new term, integrated landscape management, which seemed neutral at the time. And of course, as time goes on, no term stays neutral. And after 5 years, you'll have to put that on the shelf and come up with something else. But I think a lot about that in the context of climate smart agriculture, which we've also been involved with in some way, probably since kind of its beginning, meaning the beginning when the term developed, I think around 2010 or something, and FAO came up with a definition, the World Bank came up with a definition, and I find in the work that we do, in the field, I use the example, we're talking about sub-Saharan Africa, and I was just involved in an exercise of trying to support the development of a program of climate smart agriculture. So went around and because this example was from Tanzania and also in Mozambique, and it was really interesting. The same kinds of things were happening, where you would come and you would talk to the people who are supposed to be the key stakeholders in the development of this program. So this included meetings with government officials and also with NGOs and with farmer organizations. And if you would say, okay, what are you doing? What are you doing for climate smart agriculture? And of course, they won't have any idea what you're talking about unless someone had been there before saying that we have a program on climate smart agriculture. So you would describe what it is, and they would say, well, we since the mid '90s we've been working on conservation agriculture. We have a working group on that. Is that what you're talking about? So you can either say yes, that's what we're talking about, or no, we have climate smart agriculture, and so we're going to have to develop a working group about that also. So the point being that when it comes to sort of the design of programs and in communication at all levels, I think it's it's okay sometimes to. Well, I think it's there's a challenge of being aware of what your entry points are, and there's a lot that's kind of already going on, and when doing analysis of what the challenges are, and we go through literature, it's hard to, it's important to keep that in mind because you can kind of go in circles and chase your own tail. Okay, so the other point is about scale and just general ambition. So the question of adoption, I think, in addition to all the things in the paper, I was looking for things that weren't in the paper to sort of food for thought. That I think adoption will be influenced by kind of if the proposed solutions are going to solve the ultimate problem. And so some of these kind of practices and technologies that were sort of described in the paper certainly can solve some of those challenges if they are adopted. So agroforestry or conservation tillage, things like that. Let's say you have a certain set of environmental and economic problems in a particular place, and if we have a world of climate change where we limit it to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which I think now we know we're already not going to do, that yes, that's like an appropriate level for that place to think about. And I think actually all of us have talked about this scale at some point. But if you're talking about 2.5 degrees and 3 degrees and 4 degrees and things like that, I mean, I think there's this sort of the landscape question of, okay, you're trying to conserve water more broadly, and you have to think beyond the farm. And this is something that we think about a lot. But also beyond that, you have to really start thinking outside of agriculture, frankly. I mean, these issues become issues of urbanization and refugees at 3 degrees and 4 degrees. So I think it's important. Again, I'm taking this entry point of both thinking of program design and things. At what point are we going to focus on practices? At what point are we going to think about landscape scale approaches? At what point are we thinking about just kind of economic development more broadly, transitioning out of some crops into other crops? And that's related to climate models, and we need to be talking to people who aren't just in the agriculture space. So that's what I have.
Okay, great, thank you. So we're going to come to you with questions in just a little bit. But Seth, I had one question for you. Part of your role at Eco-Agriculture Partners is specifically policy advocacy, okay? And let's put aside this communication terminology question, and let's just not have that be part of our consideration here. But if you're saying that for CSA overall, we have these opportunities for high impact interventions, but there's low adoption, what is the implication of that in the policy advocacy space? Given that, we talked about we don't have the full evidence base, we have these we have to be mindful of the social and cultural barriers. We are looking at a very localized context. Given all that was said, and your role is one of policy advocacy, how are you able to engage in that space in that context?
Well, I guess I would just say, in a situation where there's a demonstrated benefit of a certain type of practice that no one is doing, because I guess there's not, it's either not culturally appropriate or there's no economic incentive. I mean, you really have two basic options, and this won't be news to you. I mean, you can either force people to do it through some sort of regulation, or you can develop a payment for ecosystem service program. And I think the sort of a lot of the policy conversation in the kind of environmental world is essentially about finding the balance between those things. And before there were, even in the context of climate smart agriculture, there is a lot of talk about carbon credits and mitigation. That's actually something we've done a fair amount of work in as well. And there are efforts to bring, especially with smallholder farmers, particularly in Africa, I know CCAFS has done a lot of work on this, of trying to find ways to get financial incentives to smallholder farmers to do things that in the long term will benefit them, but in the short term, as you say, if it disrupts their short-term cycle, then they won't do it. But I guess the caveat to that is, yes, possibly, but there could also be cash payments. So that's one of the things that people talk about doing. So.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let's open it up to you. Because of time constraints, I'd like you to give your name quickly, your affiliation, get very quickly to your question, please, so that we can take a few questions. So please raise your hand and my colleague will come to you with the microphone. So who has questions, comments, thoughts, reactions? You guys were so talkative before. Come on. Yes, please.
Thank you so much for this. My name is Tanya Raw, and I'm with CARE, and I focus also on the policy and advocacy side of the intersection between food, nutrition security, and climate change. I was very pleased to see that the study flagged the incredible importance of the social context in which farmers are operating. This is an issue that we have raised time and again, that the success of something, in order for something to be climate smart, it has to take that social context into account. What we find in a lot of the discussion about climate smart agriculture, though, is that it still comes back to the biophysical aspects and the different practices that can be adopted. So what are the barriers to broadening the discussion when we talk about climate smart ag, to recognize those social factors that make farmers vulnerable, that limit their access to the resources and information they need to adopt other practices that are climate smart? And how do we incentivize policymakers and practitioners to more rigorously look at those issues and to perhaps put communities in the driver's seat when it comes to their own agricultural practices? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yes, other questions, thoughts, reactions? So Ed, I recall the last time that we sat in this room, and you made a very compelling point about livelihoods and how we talk about livelihoods. And I know in this study today, you talked about livelihoods as a way of organizing and viewing the world. And the last study, which was looking at some of the work that Mercy Corps was doing, and we were looking at livelihoods, you made a very salient point about livelihoods being very dynamic. That it was not just sort of once, you know, we can't say there's just one set of livelihoods and then work with that. And I wonder to what degree in looking at CSA in this work that you were able to account for that dynamism in livelihoods. And how does that dovetail with, I think, the point that Caitlin was making earlier about being iterative and learning as we go along. So that was one question that I had for you. And I think you had a question or point that you wanted to make also.
That gets me to where I was going to go, so thank you. So really quickly, I won't spend really any time on this. Livelihoods is like my thing. It's my area of research. It's what I think about. And really what I've done over the last, I'm getting old, 19 odd years, is think about how livelihoods are more than making a living. They are ways of ordering the world. So it's ordering your material world, but also ordering your social and your political and your economic worlds, and how you get all those things aligned in certain ways, which means that livelihoods are fundamentally, again, about not just what you're going to eat, but who gets to eat it and who actually gets to grow it and how they grow it and what's the right way to do that and what happens if you don't do it that way. And all of those things get bundled into this. So when I talk about climate smart interventions stepping into that space, that's the complexity of the things we're dealing with here. And so this actually then leads me to thinking about a couple things I wanted to say really quickly. One of the things I heard from Seth was, you know, the adoption is influenced, of course, if the proposed solutions address the ultimate problem. But there's a meta question here, which is which problem and who defined it. And the problem is, I think this goes to actually the question that was asked a second ago, is very often that problem was not actually defined by the people we expect to take it up. And so that leads to a kind of a disjoint there that, you know, really reflects the mismatches you're seeing in our study, I think, starting to show up. Another way to frame this, we keep talking about climate smart agriculture, but in the here and now, there isn't a lot of climate dumb agriculture. Not in the places we're talking about. Think about this for a second. We're talking about agriculturalists living on less than $2 a day with very little information, very little input, sometimes very poor market access, crappy infrastructure, and they're still alive. If they were bad at this, they'd be dead. So we're by implication, when we talk about climate smart agriculture and that we have to intervene, we are somehow saying that whatever's being done is not. And I think we have to think about that because in the short term, in terms of climate variability, I think it probably is quite smart. In the longer term, there's a really big question here when climate change gets pulled into this. The rates of change we are seeing in the biophysical world, will they outstrip livelihood systems, these people's efforts not just to make a living, but to order the world, their ability to change those systems at the same pace? And so then, to a point I think that Caitlin made earlier, there's 2 points that Caitlin made that I want to emphasize. One of these is then the question, sort of flipping the question, as you said it, and kind of trying to figure out what the ultimate thing we're trying to fix is, which means going the other way in some ways. But the other thing is sort of, let's see, in terms of thinking about what the point of entry for these bigger and broader changes is. In other words, can we stack interventions to think about what one does right now and how those might transition over time into other things that people could come to grips with and work with over time, as opposed to walking into a place and saying, we're gonna have to change your ag system, which is akin to, in a lot of agrarian settings, we're changing your whole world. And that isn't going to work. You're blowing up traditional authority, you're blowing up gender roles, you're blowing up all kinds of stuff when you do that. There's your adoption challenge in a lot of ways. So it's not that we can't do this, it's not that we can't address these kinds of things. We have to think much more carefully about what we're doing.
What about Tanya's question of moving on this exclusive focus from biophysical aspects to what are the barriers to broadening the discussion? Any thoughts on that? Please, yes.
Okay. Well, the way to address that is to begin to take a look at agricultural systems as comprising the social as well as the ecological components. Again, it comes back to the livelihood approach, which, if I remember very well, comprises of 4 components: the human, the social, the ecology, as well as the economics. So if we fail to use this paradigm, then there's always the tendency to always think that it is about bringing out crops or producing milk from livestock is the only thing. So that's it.
Yeah, I guess I would just add on that, saying that from my experience, it's a lot about who's in the room. And I think that's why these biophysical discussions are dominating when you're sitting down with the Ministry of Agriculture in whatever country and their technical institutions. That tends to be where that conversation goes. And I think we just need to find better ways to ensure that that conversation is broadened when the priorities, what's important, what are the goals are being discussed. And sometimes you have that option and in other places you don't, but I think pushing that is important. And then the second piece that I think is a real challenge is information flow across levels. And I obviously don't have an answer to that necessarily, but obviously in some countries like Kenya, where you have devolved governance systems, your decisions are being taken at a different level, and maybe exploring different governance options and mechanisms in different countries could be interesting. But I think at this point, a lot of times you're having these broader programs and incentives designed at a high level, and the information about the actual priorities and social concerns is not getting through. And I think that's not news, but we have to get somehow better at it and at scale, and hopefully we can, push that at a regional, global level.
Seth, any thoughts?
I mean, this is an issue of just in agriculture, not just climate smart agriculture, sustainable agriculture. So I also don't have the solution. I mean, just broadly, we would say, just kind of get more people to the table, hear more voices, get them together in ways where there's good facilitation, so they have more, maybe political power than they otherwise would. And that's...
I think that in and of itself has to be incentivized. Yeah, possibly.
Can I make my almost perpetual plea to engage academia? Granted, we're half the problem, I know. But in all seriousness, there is a pile of literature in disciplines like anthropology and geography and sociology that actually makes a ton of these points. It's already there. I mean, unfortunately, it's not comprehensive. It's not global. It's bit by bits. But a lot of the lessons have been learned. It's actually now we know, frankly, we know what data we need. I had the good fortune to be part of a USDA agriculture and food security report that just came out this past year. And one of the findings we had in the report, actually, because those of you who know food security, you know, it's availability, so production, it's access, it's utilization, and it's stability, right? We got great data on production. Our data on access is mostly garbage worldwide. It's kind of predicated on pricing, which is such a bad proxy for access in most places. And yet we think we know what's going on. So they're just different sources of data out there, and you can actually just go pull stuff off a shelf. You don't have to commission a new study. Pull something off a shelf, compare it to what people are doing with like price data, show them the difference. I'm an academic, I still believe in empirics. I know I'm in DC and those are just opinions, but still, I believe in empirics. And so I think there's a lot that can be done just in that realm if you can get in the right room with the right people. I do take that point rather critically.
Good, great. Were we going to have a quick report out on the survey results?
Yeah, we didn't quite get the PowerPoint, but maybe Ed, you can just.
What do you want me to do?
It's just like, interestingly, these are pretty much the diversity across answers. Like all 20 of them are. So there's nothing that even came from this group as.
Okay. You guys are experts. We have a problem. And I don't say that because you don't know anything. It's because what was David just pointing out to me is we have one or two people pointing out different things across like this incredibly wide suite of stuff. You guys clustered on nothing, which is really interesting. You have just a tremendous range of incentives and then an equally tremendous number of barriers. And when I say like didn't cluster, I mean, these guys are looking over my shoulder to say, no, I'm not lying. You guys did go with initial cost at 17% of you. That was like a really outstanding number to give you a sense. And like in terms of barriers, incentives, impact on resilience was like 13%, thank you. At least I agree with you. Collective action and local organizational capacity was like 13%, but everything else are extremely, extremely low numbers. So again, I think that we're still dealing with an environment where everyone's experiences, one by one, where you are, which practice you work with, that kind of stuff still dominates the ways in which we understand this, which is both good because we're talking about specificity, but is also a big challenge when we think about scaling and the questions that people have been asking.
Great. So yes, we'll take some additional questions. Let's start at the back, Benjamin. Yes, at the back? And if you can quickly get to your question, your name, affiliation, and
Michelle
question.
Jennings, USAID. I'm wondering what you would say about maybe not looking so much at like production-focused metrics, but looking at ecosystem services and the role of education or the lack thereof of just general ecology and how we tackle that to kind of, challenge that food system.
Great, thank you. Yes, I think we had, yes.
Jonathan Cook, also at USAID. Thanks, Ed, and all the team for the report. I guess just going back to a word that was mentioned by Ademola, which is trade-offs. I mean, I think what I'm hearing a lot of the comments reflect is we have these three poles of this thing we call CSA, and the incentives and the interests in them are not aligned across these groups because of reasons of time frame, because of reasons of the actual benefits that are being seen or not seen. We can't really assume that this is a win-win-win in the way we may want it to be from the development perspective. And I think a lot of what I'm hearing reflects that. Farmers are looking to feed their families, to earn income, perhaps to adapt on a certain time frame to climate risk. But again, there's a challenge with the different climate risks in the present versus the future. And then the mitigation part of this, right? The carbon storage part, where we like to assume that there's a co-benefit involved in storing carbon, but that's not always, again, appropriately maybe prioritized in the present by the people we're working with. So just to reflect on that and maybe to hear more from the panel on this issue of how to sufficiently align these poles and these perspectives among these different users, because I sense that a lot of these adoption issues relate back to that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yes, we have a couple more here.
Hi, Under Mershon, also from USAID. One topic that I didn't hear come up in the panel is the explosive population growth that's happening in a lot of these areas, and the youth bulge that we're seeing in a lot of these areas. And this has been a major topic of discussion within USAID as we've been thinking about our new food security strategy. And Ed talked a lot about kind of social norms and kind of people's place in society, and then all of a sudden you've got there's a lot of concern in the agricultural community about kind of, your average farmer has his ages in the 50s and the 60s, and, are the youth going to want to do the same thing? And I'm wondering, I didn't hear that come up as kind of a constraint or an opportunity in all this discussion, and I'm curious as to how that relates to this, because you've got a whole lot of people who are coming in and perhaps want different things or are living in different circumstances, and with the more pressures and visibility from the outside world, and how that affects what you're trying to do here as well.
Great, thank you. Yes, I think there was someone else, yes?
Trey Taylor's my name with Verdant Power Marine Renewable Energy Company. It seems to me I work at the Department of Commerce on an advisory committee with technological solutions, renewable energy side. So the quick question is this: it seems to me what's missing is a comprehensive plan that is designed by the community once that community is informed with information, which they don't have. So what I'm getting at is information is only as good as you know what to do with it, and that information is not being disseminated. And the starting point isn't us telling the community what they need to do, it's the community setting the priorities for what to do. So my question is that the absence of a comprehensive plan for that community part of the problem?
Okay, great, thank you. And then Tanya, I think you had a quick follow-up. So Benjamin, did we lose Benjamin? Yes. Lene, if you can come around this side and.
Thanks, Roger Mark. I wanted to put it back to the panel and challenge us a bit on this notion that it depends on who we have in the room, because increasingly when it comes to the issue of gender inequality and how much it impacts climate vulnerability and food nutrition insecurity, it has to be everyone's responsibility to begin talking about the role that gender equality plays. If climate resilience and food security are our ultimate goals, and I think those are shared goals, it's something that we all need to begin talking about so that it's not just up to the women's groups who can very easily just not be invited. So I put it back to the panel to question whether each of us is interested in beginning to raise these more difficult questions. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So we have five questions, and I'll just go through them, and you can address one or a few of them. So the question of moving beyond production to look at ecosystem services and the role of education therein, looking at trade-offs and what does it mean in terms of recognizing that we may not necessarily get to a win-win-win situation. What about questions around population growth and youth bulge and those pressures? How can we better engage in comprehensive plans that are driven by communities and community engagement? And finally, does it really matter that, is it really a question of who's in the room? How can we have this common responsibility around gender questions and inclusion of women? So, Ademola, can we start with you?
Well, let me take the issue of population. Is both a challenge and an opportunity in Africa. Currently, 230 million people are food insecure in the continent, and this could increase to 350 million by 2050 if climate change is not adequately addressed. Now, that is the challenge. Now, the opportunity that we know is that by 2030, the food and beverage markets could top $1 trillion in value. That's an opportunity. Another opportunity is this, the fact that, like I said the other time, we have an engaged private sector. Then the youth also are quite entrepreneurial. So what it just requires is how we turn this the challenge of the increasing population growth and the demand that it brings up to an opportunity to develop the food market in the continent. And this can be done through a host of some of the interventions that I mentioned the other time. And in particular, the private sector is increasingly seen as one of the tools to use to bring about the needed transformation in the continent. So it's true that the population is growing and so on and so forth, but with carefully designed programs across sectors, we can actually seize the opportunity and build a resilient food system that will address the needs of the growing population. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Ed?
Those are a lot of good questions. I'll try to take like a couple of them, but quickly. The population growth question, though, is also a very tricky one, and it's actually the outcomes that you're talking about, Andre. Will people stay on farms? What do they want? Those kinds of things are themselves not just economic decisions; they're deeply social decisions. So my team and I have now something on the order of 700 qualitative interviews across 8 livelihood zones in southern Mali and now Mopti, looking at people's livelihoods and thinking about them very comprehensively as, again, ways that people organize the world. And I'll give you just one example of where this becomes really, really tricky. In several of these livelihood zones, especially among Bambara-speaking peoples, men farm millet. That is one of the definitions of a man. And on top of that, the man feeds his family. If you don't do that, you actually kind of fail to fit that social category, so much so that we found guys who were like petrol sellers who were making huge amounts of money, and they still had a millet field. They didn't care about it. They like throw seeds at it and leave. But they had to have a millet field, because if they didn't count as a man. So this becomes an extraordinarily complex challenge for thinking about, do you leave the farm and go to the city? Well, if you leave the farm and you don't farm anymore and you go to the city, you may not be going back ever, because you won't fit those social categories anymore. And that's part of the calculus that people are working with. So yes, they'll leave farms, but it isn't a straightforward decision. It's an extraordinarily complex one. And think of it, I just said that for men. Do that math for, by the way, young men, old men, different kinds of decision making because they have different kinds of power. Then you get into women, then you get into all kinds of other categories. You can see how challenging this gets to figure this out. In terms of trade-offs, Jonathan, it's a really, really good point, and I just don't think that I don't know that we've had enough information to frame it as honestly as we need to, actually. I think that conceptually we could see win-win-win, but then in particular places we just hadn't done enough of it. We hadn't actually gathered enough information to figure out if it could be, in fact, win-win-win, or where it didn't quite work out. My suspicion is there's probably places in the world where it actually works out for everybody. And I suspect there's places in the world where it works out for nobody. And then everybody else is somewhere in the big mash in between. And we're back to trying to figure out what information we need to actually assess that kind of thing. Which then goes to my last point, which is the question of who do we have in the room. On one hand, I absolutely agree about issues of gender and, frankly, social differentiation more broadly. If you follow feminist thought out, it's no longer really about gender. It's about identity and difference and how those play out in different societies. And that's something my lab and I have been working on, actually with USAID quite a bit in the adaptation space. So this is something that's really, really important. But at the same time, I disagree only in that I am an institutional realist. I worked for one, so that's probably part of why. And I recognize that to affect change, you have to start somewhere with somebody and demonstrate value somewhere. And so this is why we have this giant pile of empirical data, is to show people that, hey, if you go with this livelihoods approach, you can see all kinds of things that you can't see otherwise, and hey, your projects work better. And get a few people to buy in, and then they start to spread this out, and you can work over time. So who you have in the room, I think, does matter, but it's not a cop-out. It's a different kind of thing.
Thank you. Caitlin?
Sure. I think John, I'll talk to your point first on these trade-offs. I think it's very challenging to think about the triple win as an every practice kind of requirement. For me, that's never really worked. What I'd be interested in seeing explored a bit more is triple wins, but across landscapes or in jurisdictions where you're trying to achieve goals, especially when it comes to that mitigation piece. I've never really felt comfortable with where that discussion has gone, and thinking about that being something that is a smallholder farmer's priority or responsibility. And I think that there's a lot of room for thinking about how to achieve those triple wins in different ways, recognizing that this is a global challenge, but there's different ways to focus on that. So I think that would be my my points there on the trade-offs. And I do think we are trying to gather more data on the trade-offs. This is something I've been working on for years, but it depends on also how you measure it. What indicators are you using? I wasn't even going to bring this up, but there's so many challenges with what we're even calling CSA. It goes to your definition point and how we're measuring that and how we're measuring change, that I think it does make it a little bit challenging with that trade-off discussion as well. But and every place that you're going to be doing CSA, there's different priorities based on the context, the political, social context. So I think as understanding and transparently saying these are what our priorities are for this type of CSA program or intervention, and this is how we're going to try to address those trade-offs, at least can maybe push that conversation a little bit further. So that's what I'd say on the trade-offs. In terms of the population and urbanization piece, I haven't thought through this fully, but there is a debate going on, of course, about whether it's even ethically appropriate to be trying to promote people to stay in agriculture on these very small farms, and whether that's what we should really be putting our money to try to maintain, or if there are other shifts that should be being supported. I think that's a very interesting debate that's ongoing and worth looking into. Let's see, in terms of, I guess that kind of touches to Michelle's point, maybe thinking about broader metrics as well, and are we looking at kind of the bigger system and what does resilience really mean? That can go there, and then, yeah, I didn't mean to be a cop-out on who's in the room. I didn't even realize I was doing that, so that's probably a problem in and of itself. But yeah, it is a challenge when you're working in certain countries where you don't have control, but you want to push that agenda and doing that in a way that's appropriate. And I think the more vocal advocates we have in CARE has been one of those that I've worked with in Africa. That's every time I'm in a meeting with CARE, we always talk about gender, and I think that's really important, and it needs to be more than just one institution that's known for that, and I think that's a very good point, so I appreciate that a lot. Yeah.
Thank you. Seth?
I guess I'll respond to this issue of moving beyond production to also include ecosystem services. And in the context of climate smart agriculture, I think that the institutions that are working this, I think, intend to do this, at least sort of in theory. It's kind of it's written that this should happen. I think that sometimes that can be a very complicated thing because it involves bringing together different sectors, and so in practice it remains insular because I think again I think a lot of the work on climate smart agriculture is still happening within kind of agricultural ministries. That's where you would sort of go first for these types of programs, and I guess I would then throw back to sort of challenge for the people who are working on these kinds of things. There are a lot of potential synergies when you bring in these sort of sustainable land and water management practices, which compromise what I think we're calling climate smart agriculture in a lot of cases. These are also the same things that would be considered potentially biodiversity friendly or water friendly or something like that. So there are certainly a lot of examples, one can give of where that is happening, but I think it still is not quite the dominant practice. That's what I would say. But I think it's getting better. It's getting better. I mean, I think there's a recognition. There's a wide recognition. There's a need for it, but it's kind of easier said than done. And so that's kind of where things are now.
Great, thank you. So, as I reflect on our discussion today, I've been, this idea of this survey, what did you know coming into the room and what do you know afterwards? I sort of have three takeaways from our discussion today. The first is what I would put under the title of there is no climate dumb agriculture. So, we heard Ed talk a little bit about this, and I think that is what we see the results coming out of the study, looking at livelihoods as a way of organizing the world, looking at the dominant narratives, having a sense that economics matter, that we need to account for social and cultural values, that access to markets continues to be important, and there's this mismatch understanding between the research and the reality. So that sort of contextualization, for me, I thought was really compelling. The second point was, I think, for me, the discussion we had had about the barriers to broadening the discussion. You know, how do we move above and beyond just the biophysical dimensions of it? And I think we talked about that in terms of developing an evidence base, questions around the trade-offs, knowledge systems, financing for CSA and beyond, communication challenges, and sort of moving beyond production to the ecosystem services focus. So to me, that sort of fit into that category. And then finally, I was, taken by Caitlin's point again about having high impact CSA practices but low adoption, and what that meant for incremental adoption when we're thinking of transitional system change. That was, I thought, for me, really important framing and recognizing that that needs to be context specific, that there's a need for iterative learning, that we're looking up to pathways for scaling up. How do we deal with the tricky, sticky issues like population growth, and what does that mean in terms of really how we produce shifts and how we approach that, and also what that means for community engagement, and then your points about engaging the private sector. So I think those are sort of three key takeaways to me. But join me in thanking the panel, I think, for a very stimulating discussion. Once again, this was webcast live, so it is now video archived. You can come back and look at the discussion. There will be a summary of the discussion on our blog platform, New Security Beat, and Ed's PowerPoint presentation is also available online. So thank you for joining us, and please stay with us to network further over wine. As you step outside, we have some opportunities for us to continue to engage and further discuss. So thank you. Guys.
Yeah.
This was great. So please keep my card.
Sure, okay.
And I
Great
look
study, very
forward to viewing